Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the next in our series of Agency Masters. Today's webinar is on the age-old issue that many agencies face of scope creep and over-servicing. So today's session will hopefully be covering the real causes behind scope creep, the impact on projects and overall profitability, and how to spot it early, avoid the trap, and also kind of delve into structuring internal comms and managing client expectations. So as I said before, I'm pleased that we've got quite a few people registered today. So it's clearly a scenario that affects you all. But before we jump in, for those who don't know me or haven't joined on previous webinars, I'm Steve. I'm one of the co-founders here at the Agency Works. And I've been working with agencies for around 22 years now. And as usual, I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Kate, who is not only a principal consultant here at the Agency Works, but somebody who has years of agency experience working with lots of client services teams and also trying to manage scope creep, I assume. So looking forward to your insights as well, Kate. Appreciate that you're all busy. So this webinar should take, as usual, around 20-25 minutes. So hopefully time to grab a cuppa before you get pulled into the rest of your day. So we all know it happens. You try and catch it before it gets out of hand, but before you know it, it's taking you over budget and possibly also delayed work, by which point it can just feel easier to carry on, typically because you might fear losing the client. So every demand, every amend and every additional resource request is pretty much accepted. Then it's too late and you're looking back with head in your hands thinking, what's happened? You could have lost money, but you've also lost control of the project.
Absolutely. And we all do it at some point. There's an extra hour here, maybe even a day there. So it's really easy to do. And maybe it's only seen as a deliverable or two, but on the whole, it's disruptive and distracting from the original project objectives that should have been outlined sort of earlier on. And it's also worth noting that even if you go over by just 1 hour on each project, say 20 projects a month, that's a potential revenue loss of about £2,000 every month. So that really puts that at only an hour into perspective. Or to put it another way, and as it states on that lovely meme of myself and Francesca, not sure why it's always a meme of me that finds their way into these webinars. But anyway, if you overservice by 10%, you're effectively working for free for 6-ish weeks every year. So as you can see from my face, that's a very scary thought.
It is scary indeed. I mean, the stat, not your face.
Yeah, thanks,
That's what I
mate.
was talking about. And anybody who's attended previous webinars will know that we love a stat. So here's another one for you. According to the Project Management Institute, around 50% of agency projects head out scope, with nearly 40% of those going over budget as a result. So those quick feature adds or the small edits don't feel so small anymore, and especially when they're putting such a pressure on time and budget. And we've not even touched on team morale.
And, agencies all overservice to a certain degree. It's part of keeping the client and sometimes your team happy. And overservicing might become a strategic decision if you're taking into account our 3 favourite words, which are, they're on the screen now, making sure they fall into the categories of either fame, fortune, or fun.
I think that's meant to be me there, but it's an interesting question, and what I wanted to kind of pick you up on is with your years' experience working with client services teams, would you say it's literally all about just keeping the client happy?
Wow, yes. Client happiness is obviously key. But if you're bowing down to every unscoped edit and amend that come in, you're stepping away from that role as easy for you to say, strategic partner. And instead you're creating that unhealthy work environment of the supplier. And you're then sending your team into that same environment with expectation of them to deliver the same quality work with a smile. So really, it's about balance. To maintain those relationships and, importantly, revenue, you need to set boundaries with your clients.
Yeah, I think those boundaries are really important. I think what we've seen and heard from our time with working with agencies is the flip side of all those yeses. So what is the real impact of scope creep on agencies? And we've picked out a few here. Yeah, this is a kind of a fairly key one. The reality is, if there is scope creep, your bottom line is going to take a hit. Costs are going to go up, additional time and resources are going to be pulled in, which means you can say goodbye to profitability. We also know there are many components that make up a project or make a project a success. And when things start to head off track, it can set everything else off. And of course, there are more variables within that, things like annual leave and availability of resource. That also ties in with capacity, because we know when work is delayed, it impacts on your capacity to deliver other additional work that you've won. So it's going beyond impacting just that project success, but agency success as a whole. So you end up with your team rushing things through that can impact on the quality of work with nothing being finished off. It's also really important to establish your working relationship, as your client potentially won't see that scope creep as a one-off and will expect to have that same flexibility every project that you do. So whether it's around things like the number of amends or additional extras, it will make deadlines become pretty meaningless. Also, if you are stuck fulfilling demands on a project that was estimated to have finished 2 weeks ago, it means less time on building both your existing client pipeline, but also your new business one too. And you're also losing time managing other clients and developing potential new campaigns. And finally, it impacts on morale. We know that your agency is your people and your people do your work. So if they're bogged down on projects and end up dealing with unhappy clients, an unhappy team, which won't either be productive or engaged, let alone want to stay.
Absolutely. So that's the impact, but let's just rewind. What are the causes behind scope creep and where does it go wrong? So the first one there, amends. So amends. Doing 15 rounds, perhaps a little bit of exaggeration, perhaps not, instead of the scoped 3. And the second one, too many stakeholders. So this could be both client and agency side. Make sure you're gathering all the amends before you put them through to your resourced team. Unclear and changing briefs, always a hot topic, I think. You quite often find people posting about this on LI. But once a scope is agreed and a brief changes, you need to make sure that the scope changes too. The fourth one, underestimating. So make sure you're talking to the team doing the work when you're putting the estimate and your scope together, because you need to make sure that you're giving them enough time. And remember the difference between an estimate and a commercial quote, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. Poor management or process, of course, the processes have to be there in the first place, but making sure that your junior team are supported too. Miscommunication, which is a big one, and they're all big ones, obviously, but this boils down to proper project planning and making sure everyone is on the same page on how the project is going to pan out. Lack of team training. So I touched on this on a previous point, but this doesn't have to necessarily be like formal training, although obviously it can. But also make sure that your junior team are supported and mentored in the hows and whens. Perfection and innovation. So I think I told you this story before, Steve, of the dev I left to get on with a project without having proper check-ins. What he delivered was an absolute thing of beauty, but it was way, way out of scope. And we all know that creatives want perfectionism, but it's not always what the client has paid for. And lastly, lack of commerciality. So we've touched on this in previous webinars, and I've done a couple of LI posts on it and a blog. But if your CS team don't have commercial awareness, then that's when the extra hour here and there doesn't matter. Your team need to understand the commerciality of the agency.
So we've looked at where things can go wrong, but what strategies can agencies adopt to minimize the risk of overservicing, but also ensuring that you remain profitable and, more importantly, the relationship with the client remains healthy? So we've picked out a few here. The first, I think, is getting clarity from the start. We talked about briefs. You've got a better chance of success if you've got a well-defined brief. And that means every detail from objectives to deliverables clearly articulated to prevent misunderstandings and skewed expectations a bit further down the line. To do that, we need to ask the right questions. So it's about digging deeper at the briefing stage, clarify vague points, uncover hidden expectations. Just ensure that all stakeholders are aligned on the project's goals. And finally, document everything. So once that brief is agreed upon, make sure it's well documented, and this can serve as a reference point throughout the project to help keep everybody on track and focused on that agreed upon scope.
Yeah, and from that brief, then we're wanting to make sure that we've got a clear statement of work and a good handover. So be completely clear on the objectives, why you're doing it, who it's targeting, what it needs to achieve. This will help you stay objective when pushback, if you get pushback from the client, becomes subjective.
And yeah, we mentioned it before, but it's about setting those clear boundaries. It sounds simple, but establishing a precise definition of what constitutes an amend. So you need to differentiate between minor tweaks and significant changes that require additional time and resources, and make sure this is communicated to the client up front. Also need to include a set number of revisions within the initial scope and make it clear that any additional amend will or could be billed separately. And again, finally, that process needs to be formalized. You need to create a structured process for handling amends. So whether that's using a change request form, you need to ensure that every amend is documented and assessed for the impact on both timeline and budget, and again, formally approved before any work begins.
Absolutely. And accurate estimating. So we're talking estimated versus your quote here. And I touched on this a little bit earlier. Your estimate is your internal facing document, and this should reflect how long something is actually going to take. Whereas your quote is your client facing or your commercial document, taking into account any value add or any discount. Now, don't get into that trap of retrofitting your estimate to your quote. So, for example, my client has £1,000 to spend. I'll therefore estimate 10 hours of time when it realistically needs 15 hours. If you do this, then you're doomed to overservice, and it becomes impossible to know if the project is actually on track.
Yeah, and tied into that, accurate estimating is obviously without the accurate estimate, then obviously it's very difficult to do proper project and resource planning. So we need to ensure that each project has that right mix of talent and time, because we know that under-resourcing can lead to burnout and mistakes, while over-resourcing can lead to inefficiencies and over-servicing. You also need to plan in that estimate for contingencies. So that means building in a buffer for unexpected delays or changes. This can help you stay on track even when things don't go to plan, and hopefully can prevent that need for excessive over-servicing to catch up if it does. And then the third point, which is definitely the most important of all, is the use of an industry-leading agency management system, mentioning no names. This can help you keep track of tasks, deadlines, resources, but also helps us visualize project progress and also quickly identify where things may be slipping.
That kind of leads on nicely to real-time tracking and WIP reviews. And I'm not going to be quite so coy as Steve. We use a tool called Synergist to keep an eye on our estimated versus our actual values. And this allows us to see how far we are through the project, enabling us to have conversations on if we have enough time to finish a project off. And of course, having regular WIP reviews will enable you to have those conversations internally, initially, but also feeding that back to the client.
I think also the client needs to be involved in this process, and it's about setting expectations early. So whether that's from the first meeting, you need to discuss and agree what's included in the scope, how many changes will be handled, and also the communication, what it will look like in the future. This hopefully will prevent misunderstandings later on. That also includes regular check-ins, so keeping that line of communication open to discuss progress, challenges, and any future potential issues. And finally, it's about being transparent and assertive. So if the client does request something that is outside of the agreed scope, be transparent about the implications for the project's budget and timeline. It's also important to be assertive in those conversations because it helps protect the agency from scope creep, but it still does kind of maintain that positive client relationship.
And the last one on our slide there is post-project reviews. And these are imperative to learn from successful projects as well as those that may have gone out of scope. Ask your client for written feedback and then maybe have a call to discuss it, and make sure everything from that written feedback and the call are documented so you can share it with your wider team. This will not only help your team to understand the good and the bad, but it also helps with that strategic partner relationship, as your client will feel valued.
So hopefully some useful tips there, but at the heart of this is the need for data and clear visibility of that data. That's what makes a difference. That's what allows you to spot where you could be over-servicing earlier on. So how do you go about that? Well, as Kate mentioned, I was a little coy before, but I'm sure a lot of you on this call won't be too shocked to know that we, along with a lot of agencies on this webinar, use Synergist to provide this data. And for those use that do use Synergist or will know that it provides clear visibility, it highlights what's on track, and more importantly, what's not on track. Now, I'm not going to give you a full demo of the system, but I just want to quickly highlight how Synergist or other agency management systems can help agencies keep track of projects and hopefully avoid over-servicing. So we've got a few screenshots here. So whether you're using job lists or dashboards, you have an instant visibility of the financial health and progress of jobs. So whether you're tracking estimate versus quoted or invoice versus recognized or actual time and costs, it can provide everybody who's working on the project that instant live view of project completion and highlights any potential overruns and impact on profits. And again, that's represented nice visually by the thermo bars. If you do over-service as well, the system has a nice little feature, which can be quite scary at times, the number. We call it client investment, but basically it's your under-over recovery figure. So it highlights how much time you spent working on a client compared to what they've paid you. And it kind of highlights your kind of vampire clients. So which of your clients are taking up more of your time than they're paying for. So it's quite a scary figure, but it does give you an idea of kind of where the problems lie. Now, obviously, other systems are available, but whatever you use, it's having access to this data that helps us identify where this is an issue and potentially where it may be an issue in the future.
Yeah, we all love a bit of data, don't we? And Steve just showed us what the data can look like in a project management system, but it's our people that have to deal with that data, and we're all human. So how can we help our team? Well, I think this really, we're talking about support, and the agency leaders and your SLT need to support their team, ensuring that they have the skill set to have those honest conversations and implement those healthy boundaries with clients that we talked about. And I've put a few quick responses together that could help equip your team when the scope creep is on the horizon. Because at the end of the day, it's in everyone's best interest to be on the same page, and it shouldn't feel like you're breaking bad news to prevent scope creep. It can help your team gain confidence and have a sense of preparedness, so they won't feel caught off guard, because that's when they'll stumble back into that over-servicing again. If it really is heading out of scope, don't forget one of our favourites, Cole Sackers's magic words. Would you like an estimate with that?
And I think that goes back to the point I made before, that if you have predefined what's in and what's not in, then that question becomes very valid.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we know it happens, and again, looking at the reality, so we don't want it to happen, it does happen, so how can we plan for it? But the reality is, if you have underquoted, then we need to plan for it. Kate mentioned earlier that whole idea that if you've discounted it, you still need to have some sort of realistic internal resource estimate so we can monitor progress. If the project, though, is going over, speak to the team, speak to the client. Is there anything we can do about it? Yeah, and these are easy conversations to have, again, if you've had that predefined and agreed brief. But also, if it does happen, then ultimately we need to learn from it. It's in those project wash-ups. We need to look at what's worked well, What can we change to make sure it doesn't happen again in the future? And also it's about spotting patterns. So whether it's the same client, the same team, the same type of job, but we also need to be thinking about reframing our thinking. Is there actually an opportunity to upsell here? So if you do have that predefined brief, can we actually sell additional services and time? And also, I've got another kind of Carl Sacker's quote on the right side, which is about being strategically free, not secretly free. And what that basically means is letting the client know that you've gone over, which will hopefully enable you to charge the correct amount the next time you do it. So it's about open, honest communications.
Yeah, I love that last quote. It's a really good one, isn't it? So as usual, we've covered a lot in a short amount of time. And as we do with all our webinars, we like to leave you with 3 key takeaways. The first one being briefing and scope. So Steve and I spoke about this a lot at the beginning of the webinar, and it's essential to have both the brief and the scope documented. Otherwise, how do you know when you've got scope creep in the first place?
Yeah, next one is around just the open communications, clear expectations from the outset, agreeing and documenting how changes will be handled, what constitutes an amend and how many are included, having those regular checkups, check-ins and updates and progress. And finally, being transparent about and assertive about if and when what's required is it needs to be changed, then you can be open with your clients about that.
Absolutely. And data. So all you need is data. You know that well-known Beatles song, Steve. I joke, but having clear access to data in real time will give you the visibility before that creep happens. And if you have this, whether it's in Synergist or another platform, you get some fancy dashboards and views to boot.